Consuelo Vanderbilt's marriage to the Duke of Marlborough was horrific, and it all began with a deranged confession he made on their honeymoon. On the glittering surface, Consuelo Vanderbilt looked like she had it all. The beautiful heiress to the massive Vanderbilt wealth, her future had shone like a diamond from the moment she was born. But this American princess and million-dollar duchess didn't get a happy ending. She got an utter nightmare. In certain echelons of New York society, the upper ones, the birth of Consuelo Vanderbilt in 1877 was akin to the coming of a messiah. The eldest child and only daughter of the main Vanderbilt heir William and his wife Elva, Consuelo was all the hopes of the Gilded Age of America rolled into one. She was even named after her mother's childhood best friend. But all that glitters is very much not gold. Consuelo's mother Elva was one of the great battle axes in history, and she was determined to force old money New York families like the Astors to accept the Vanderbilt name into their ranks, despite its brutish associations. A Confederate loyalist, Elva was infamous in her hometown of Mobile, Alabama, for being a spoiled little girl who enjoyed mistreating the slaves she and her family owned. And soon, the power-tripping Elva turned her gaze on her daughter. Growing up a Vanderbilt was a hugely privileged position for Consuelo, but her privilege came with nightmarish punishments. From the beginning, Elva expected her daughter to be nothing short of perfect, and from a young age, forced Consuelo to wear a steel rod along the length of her spine to improve her posture. Not content to limit herself to her daughter's looks, Elva also rigorously corrected Consuelo's personality and behavior. If Consuelo said one word out of line, the matriarch was liable to whip the girl with a riding crop. Picking her own wardrobe was also seen as the height of rebellion. When Consuelo once complained about the clothes her mother had chosen for her, Elva snapped back. "I do the thinking, you do as you're told." And as Consuelo grew up, an enormous problem began developing. And fortunately for the poor girl, Consuelo was utterly beautiful as a young woman. So why was this beauty unfortunate? Because soon, Elva was using this as another weapon against her. The sweet, stunning Consuelo was barely in her teen years when she began getting offers of marriage from almost every man who met her. Her mother's reaction was chilling. The only suitor she even allowed Consuelo to consider was Prince Francis Joseph of Battenberg, a man Consuelo deeply disliked. To the ambitious Elva, only a prince or a duke was good enough to marry her daughter and lift up the Vanderbilt dynasty, whether Consuelo liked him or not. And while Consuelo managed to escape Prince Francis's proposal, she wouldn't be so lucky with the next one. Still, there was something her mother didn't know. While Elva planned out her daughter's titles, Consuelo had a much different idea for a groom. During the course of her debutante season, she'd met and fallen in love with the handsome Winthrop Rutherford. Still, Rutherford was no prince and no duke, and Consuelo was terrified of her mother finding out about their love. So they carried on a courtship right under Elva's nose, with Rutherford even sending Consuelo a single red rose on her 18th birthday. And then one day, they took it as far as they could. Just after her birthday, Consuelo committed her biggest act of rebellion yet. She met Winthrop Rutherford for a bicycle ride, along with her mother and some other friends in Riverside Park in Manhattan. But when they drew back from the rest of the crowd, Winthrop quickly and clandestinely proposed to Consuelo, and she accepted. If it sounds like the lovers were in a hurry, it's because they were. Something terrifying was looming. The day that Winthrop Rutherford made Consuelo Vanderbilt his fiancée, the young girl was on the edge of heading out on a long European sojourn with her mother. Consuelo was set to leave the very next day. Undeterred, Winthrop promised to trail her to Europe and elope with her once they got back stateside. If only this is what happened. Consuelo spent months soaking up European hospitality, going to tea party after tea party and meeting prince after duke. But she soon realized something had gotten terribly wrong. After 5 months, her fiancé Winthrop still hadn't shown up, nor had he written or called or done anything to hold on to the promise they had made each other that day. It was only much later that she found out the chilling truth. Consuelo's love, Winthrop Rutherford, had followed her to Europe, and even called on where she was staying in Paris. But Consuelo hadn't managed to fool her mother Elva, who cottoned on to what was going on and refused to admit Winthrop that day or any other. When he wrote frantic letters, she intercepted and destroyed them. And after all that, Elva still had her cruelest card up her sleeve, and she was about to play it. The entire time that they were in Europe, Elva had one man on her mind, Charles Richard John Spencer Churchill. The Duke had a storied history, and Elva, who had secured Consuelo an introduction to the noble at a dinner party on their trip, was foaming at the bit for Consuelo to be a part of that history. But the Duke was really a snake in the grass. When he inherited his title 2 years before they met, he found out he was practically bankrupt. In a twist on a historical theme, the Duke was fortune hunter her, and her mother Elva couldn't be happier. She stopped at nothing to keep pushing them together. After Consuelo's Europe trip wrapped up, she might have thought she would finally be free to exhale. She wasn't. Instead, Elva invited the Duke back to America to visit just a couple of months later. Consuelo was young, but she wasn't dumb. She knew what her mother was up to, and she knew it spelled certain doom. But before she could do anything about it, her mother went to horrific new lows. Sure that her daughter would try to make a break for it with Winthrop the minute the opportunity arose, Elva confronted Consuelo in a chilling way. She actually locked her up in her room like a princess in a tower and told any friends who visited that Consuelo wasn't at home. Isolated and utterly beat down, Consuelo couldn't even get in touch with Winthrop to tell him what was going on. During this period, Elva did let Consuelo out to attend the best society balls. Naturally, it was at one of these events that Consuelo happened to run into Winthrop at long last, and they shared a single dance together. It was all Winthrop needed. In a flurry, he told Consuelo he still loved her and wanted to elope. But before Consuelo could get a word out, disaster struck. While Consuelo danced with Winthrop, her eagle-eyed mother watched from the sidelines. She quickly swooped in to separate the pair as soon as possible, foiling any plans that they might have made. The fallout was unimaginable. When they got home from the ball that night, Elva demanded Consuelo see her in her private chambers, ready to give her daughter a piece of her mind. But for once, Elva Vanderbilt got far more than she bargained for. Certain of what her mother was going to say, the mild-mannered Consuelo finally put her foot down and stated her intention to marry Winthrop Rutherford. In a story with a happy ending, this would be where the heiress got her heart's desire and married the man of her dreams, despite her mother's objections. But this is no fairy tale. Instead of succumbing to her daughter's will, Elva exploded with rage, insulting Consuelo and Winthrop alike for their stupidity. Her defiance of her mother had caused Elva to have a heart attack, and the matriarch was currently clinging to life in her bedroom. Consuelo begged to see her, but her mother's emissary instead insisted, referring to last night's fight. "I warn you, there will be catastrophe if you persist." Guilt-stricken, Consuelo made a fateful decision. Consuelo couldn't bear the thought of causing fatal stress to her mother, not even if it allowed her to keep Winthrop Rutherford. So instead of holding her ground, the still teenaged girl asked the emissary to inform Winthrop that she couldn't marry him, and that she'd cancel their engagement. It must have been heartbreaking. It was also about to get so much worse. In the wake of her cancelled engagement, Consuelo was almost completely alone. Winthrop left town, her friends had stopped calling, and her mother twisted the knife in further. Almost as soon as she heard about her daughter's broken engagement, Elva miraculously recovered from her deathbed, though not enough to treat Consuelo with any warmth in the coming weeks. Elva had gradually stripped Consuelo of her independence. Now she went in for the kill. Starting in late August of 1895, Elva Vanderbilt accepted the Duke as her guest and began drumming up publicity for the marriage between her daughter and a British peer. Soon, Consuelo was going everywhere with the Duke, with Elva giving lavish balls to show her daughter off to both him and society. Everyone expected an engagement at any moment. When it finally came, it was a high society tragedy. In the end, not even the day of Consuelo's engagement to a duke was worthy of a fairy tale. The duke proposed to her in her family cottage, but he was more like a dutiful cadet than a passionate lover, and the worst was yet to come. When Consuelo reported her engagement to her younger brothers, she couldn't keep anguished tears out of her eyes. Still, she was about to find out just how awful things could get. Consuelo viewed her upcoming nuptials like a funeral march. But the preparations themselves were just as nightmarish. As soon as the engagement hit the papers, the press crudely characterized Consuelo as yet another million duchess, American heiresses who traded their wealth for a European title. As if that humiliation weren't enough, the Duke's true feelings soon became obvious. As plans for their massive, extravagant, and expensive wedding coalesced, Consuelo and her mother held a rehearsal to make sure everyone in the wedding party knew exactly what to do on the big day. But Consuelo's fiancé dealt her a cruel snub. The Duke decided he didn't need to attend the rehearsal, especially since he thought the American custom was vulgar. He did, however, make sure to show up to the settlement meeting the very next day, where he finalized Consuelo's $3 million dowry. The year of Consuelo's engagement was also the year the Vanderbilt family publicly imploded. Just months before the Duke proposed, Consuelo's mother, Elva, had filed for divorce from her father, William Vanderbilt, and the reasons were utterly scandalous. For one, William had long kept a mistress, and Elva was fed up. But that was just the polite interpretation. While Consuelo's tycoon father, William, was no saint in the boardroom or the bedroom, there was a much naughtier secret at play. In truth, Elva had known about his mistress for years. Instead, some said that the real problem was Elva's own infidelity. She had started up an affair with her husband's best friend, and was now openly courting him. On November 6, 1895, Consuelo's nightmare finally became a reality. Laced into a wedding gown her mother had chosen before her engagement, and walking beside bridesmaids her mother had handpicked, Consuelo entered the church to marry the man her mother had insisted on. As she walked down the aisle with her father, who Elva only allowed to come for the sake of appearances before he left immediately after, the crowd turned to face her. When they saw her, some of them must have started whispering. During her perfect wedding, in front of some of the most influential people in the world, it was patently obvious that Consuelo had been crying. Even worse, she had to stifle mournful sobs throughout the ceremony. To the world outside of that church, though, the marriage still looked like a triumph. It only took the honeymoon for it to all fall apart. Before marrying the Duke, Consuelo knew she didn't and probably couldn't love him. That tore her up enough. But on their honeymoon, a sinking feeling overwhelmed her. As they traveled out for their vacation to Europe, Consuelo watched her new husband preen at all the congratulatory letters he was getting from other members of the nobility, including from Queen Victoria herself. Consuelo's honeymoon had barely started before the Duke made a stunning confession to her. First, he outright admitted, with characteristic bloodlessness, that he'd only married her to save Blenheim, his ancestral home. Besides basically telling her that she amounted only to a big bank account, Consuelo's new husband revealed his real feelings. He claimed that not only had he married her for her money, but he was also fully in love with another woman and had no intention of developing any kind of romance between the two of them. Except, that is, to produce an heir. By the time Consuelo's honeymoon wrapped and she arrived at Blenheim Palace, she was a thoroughly broken woman. She not only realized her husband was a shallow man, but that she was now a duchess and subject to all the snobbery of the aristocracy that would put old money New York to shame. Terrified his American wife was going to come off ignorant and coarse, Consuelo's husband had spent most of their honeymoon drilling her on his Spencer Churchill family tree, as well as on other people of importance and rank in society. As it turned out, Consuelo nailed it. She arrived in England as the toast of the town, and commoners and aristocrats alike fell in love with her. But it wasn't all good news. Even Consuelo's arrival at her new home was an enormous disappointment. The Duke of Marlborough hadn't been kidding when he said Blenheim needed saving. Over the years, the bankrupted dynasty had had to sell off masses of furnishings and possessions, so that now the stately home was only a husk. Soon enough, she gave birth to a son, John Spencer Churchill. Her duty done, Consuelo might have settled into a quiet, unassuming life. Instead, the exact opposite happened. It all started, perhaps with a high society invitation. Gladys Deacon, the newest young American heiress on the market, secured herself an invite to Blenheim one day. Gladys and Consuelo may have been friends, but that didn't stop the socialite from stabbing Consuelo right in the back. It wasn't long before Gladys had completely supplanted Consuelo at Blenheim, and she and the Duke struck up a torrid affair that lasted over a decade. As for Consuelo's feelings on the matter, well, they weren't what you think. As it happened, Consuelo wasn't exactly bothered by her husband taking up with another woman, even if that woman was her friend. That's because she was far from faithful herself, and one of her first lovers was Scandalous. After their agonizing will they, won't they back and forth, she eventually did hook up with Winthrop Rutherford shortly after her marriage. And oh boy, did this have consequences. In 1898, Consuelo gave birth to another son, Lord Ivor Spencer Churchill, fully completing her duty by providing her husband with, as she often wryly quipped, an heir and a spare. Except there was just one incredibly shocking thing. Many believed Ivor was actually Winthrop Rutherford's son, given that the boy had very little resemblance to either the Duke or his older brother. Yet, like so many of Consuelo's romances, her dalliance with her old lover was going to go up in flames. For a brief time, it looked like Consuelo was going to get her happy ever after, at least with Rutherford. Around the time of Ivor's conception, Rutherford experienced a fit of passion and proposed that they elope together. Consuelo knew just what to do. She rushed to her husband and confessed everything, hoping now she could finally be free. Instead, all she got was more hurt and disappointment. At first, Consuelo's announcement to Marlborough seemed to be successful, and the Duke, indifferent to the bitter end, even allowed her to visit Rutherford again to decide what she really wanted to do. The very next day, Consuelo rushed to the arms of her lover, hopeful that her whole future was before her. Instead, Rutherford dealt her a heartless betrayal. When Consuelo got to Rutherford's that day, he spoke some of the harshest words in the history of love. In the interim between proposing and Consuelo visiting, he had apparently gotten a major case of buyer's remorse and presented her with one of the worst excuses for not marrying her. Apparently, he felt too attached to her to elope, and Consuelo had to go back to Marlborough with her tail between her legs. Still, when it comes to Consuelo's bedroom life, that's just the beginning. Consuelo may not have had much attraction to her husband, but she certainly seemed to like his family line. Once, Consuelo took up with his cousin Freddie Guest, who was, in fact, staying at Blenheim as a guest, and when the Duke finally got home from battle, Consuelo had another nasty surprise in store. By this point, Consuelo had given up on ever fully escaping her marriage, so she had to fall back on merely hurting her husband any way she knew how. When the Duke arrived home from the conflict, she coolly informed him that she had been sleeping with his cousin, and that she never wanted to see him in her bedroom ever again. Somehow, though, it got more twisted. Consuelo actually had affairs with no fewer than 3 of the Duke of Marlborough's cousins over the course of her marriage. When Consuelo married into the Spencer Churchill family, she inadvertently changed the course of history. That's because, before she had an heir with the Duke, none other than his cousin Winston Churchill was next in line to inherit Blenheim. The birth of Consuelo's first son helped free Winston to go into politics. In 1906, Consuelo Vanderbilt stunned the world. That year, she and her husband could finally take no more and publicly separated. It had been a decade of utter misery for both of them. Little did England know, Consuelo had more scandals up her sleeve. Since Consuelo's separation from the Duke, her domineering mother Elva had made a strange late-in-life pivot. She had transformed into, of all things, a vehement suffragette. While this was more than a little ironic, given her childhood owning slaves and her motherhood controlling her daughter, it did seem to provide twingles of feminist guilt in the matriarch, and she showed it by testifying in Consuelo's divorce. On the stand, Elva confessed that I've always had absolute power over my daughter, and she admitted she forced Consuelo into the union, begging the judge to grant the divorce for a marriage that had so obviously happened under duress. It worked. In 1921, Consuelo became a free woman, and she wasted no time enjoying that freedom. On July 4th, 1921, before the ink on her divorce papers was dry, she married again. Her second husband was the dashing French pilot and man about town Jacques Balsan, who was her lover in the days leading up to her official divorce. In fact, she and Balsan went way back. Heartwarmingly enough, Balsam had been in love with Consuelo since her debutante days. He'd fallen in love with her when he first saw her just before her 18th birthday. The less heartwarming part? A decade older than Consuelo, Balsam had been nearing his 30s at the time he first ogled the teenager. Even so, it's hard to argue with the results. The next period of Consuelo's life was everything she deserved and more. That is going to bring us to the end of the video on Consuelo Vanderbilt. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like rating, subscribe for more, and Factinate will be back with a brand new video very soon.